Behind the velvet curtains of a Fifth Avenue mansion, a widow clings to the only thing she has left, her pride. Once adored by society, Daisy Harlowe now faces ruin, her fortune fading and her reputation slipping through her fingers. But the man she once dismissed, a humble machinist with a wounded heart, is about to return, not as a servant, but as the new owner of everything she once held dear. In a world where pride divides and love redeems, one woman must choose between the comfort of her past and the courage to begin again. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what do you love most about historical romances filled with passion, redemption, and second chances? New York City, spring of 1888. The sky over Manhattan stretched in a soft lavender haze, tinged with golden light, as the grand windows of the Harlowe mansion on Fifth Avenue reflected the last blush of the afternoon. Inside, chandeliers glistened like frozen rain above a ballroom lined with silks, candelabras, and fresh-cut peonies, arranged in crystal vases imported from Paris. The scent of bergamot, beeswax, and polished mahogany floated on the air as a string quartet filled the vast hall with delicate strains of Strauss. Daisy Harlowe, in mourning for a husband whose name still echoed through railroad empires, stood at the heart of it all, serene, composed, untouched by time. Her gown, in deep violet moire silk, shimmered with each of her slow, graceful movements. Black lace framed her high collar and wrists, the only quiet nod to the widowhood she wore like a crown. Her auburn hair, swept into an elegant twist adorned with a single jet comb, revealed a swan-like neck and the soft tension in her jaw that only a trained eye might catch. Guests spoke her name in lowered tones, admiring her poise, her composure, her unshakable dignity. They did not see the ledgers locked in her study. They did not see the unopened bills, the thinning staff, the footman with torn gloves, or the maid reusing candle stubs in the servants' quarters. They praised the grandeur of the Harlowe name, while silently wagering how long it would remain on Fifth Avenue. Daisy moved through her ballroom like a figure of myth, untouchable, untouching. Her gloved hand accepted greetings with polite coolness. Her smile, though delicate, never quite reached her hazel eyes. She had become expert at the art of concealment. To the world, she remained William Harlowe's exquisite widow, untouched by scandal, aloof in mourning, still mistress of all she surveyed. Until the letter came. It arrived in the final hour of the soirée, delivered discreetly by a footman to her personal maid, then slipped into her hand as she dismissed the last guests. Its paper was thick, industrial in weight, the handwriting unfamiliar but precise. A name signed at the bottom, Elias Mercer. Daisy read it, standing beneath the gaslight of her study, her corset still tight, her gloves still on. The letter spoke of a small invention, a coiled mechanism patented years ago under William's name, but registered by accident or intention to hers. The writer asked for a meeting. Polite, formal, but there was something beneath the tone. A hesitation, a care in the phrasing that she could not quite name. She summoned him 2 days later. Curiosity, perhaps, or boredom. She did not expect the man who entered her library to be tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a suit of simple but well-tailored brown wool. His face bore the sun-kissed tone of someone familiar with labor. His eyes, grey like tempered steel, did not shrink before her. "Mrs. Harlowe," he said, bowing with a quiet gravity. She inclined her head. "Mr. Mercer, I presume." The study smelled faintly of tobacco and roses. Rain streaked against the window panes as he sat across from her, explaining the patent in quiet, measured tones. He spoke not like a man seeking favor, but like one who had come to close a forgotten chapter. She listened, half attentive, her gaze drawn unwillingly to the strong lines of his jaw, the way his hands folded politely over his cap. She noticed he did not look around the room, as others often did, not at the gold-leafed mouldings, nor the Italian fireplace, nor the portrait of William above the mantel. And then, as he prepared to take his leave, He hesitated. "There is one more thing, ma'am," he said, rising. She turned slowly, lips parted. "Yes?" He cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. Years ago, when your husband still lived, I worked in the steel foundries. I saw you once, passing through in a carriage. You looked down, and I looked up. I never forgot that moment." The room went very still. The fire hissed. Daisy's eyes sharpened, uncertain. "I kept that moment like a small light in a dark place," he continued. "When I began my own work, small tools, precision pieces, it was that image of you that reminded me to build something finer. I know my place, Mrs. Harlowe, but I wish to tell you this before I leave." The words, honest and trembling, hung in the air. Daisy's face did not change. Not even a flicker. She stood as still as her late husband's portrait behind her. "How very poetic, Mr. Mercer," she said, her voice smooth as velvet and just as cold. "But we both know that light and iron do not belong in the same furnace. Good day." He bowed again, stiffly this time. As he turned, she caught a glimpse of something in his hand. A second letter, half withdrawn from his coat pocket. "You may leave that," she said sharply. He paused. "It was—" "Never mind, ma'am." She extended her hand. "The letter, please." He placed it on the table. She picked it up, unopened, and without another word dropped it into the fireplace. Flames curled around the paper as Elias Mercer looked at her one last time. Then he left. Outside, the rain had stopped. The cobblestones glistened beneath gaslight, and the iron gates of the Harlowe estate closed behind him with a quiet finality. In the drawing room, Daisy stood alone, the firelight dancing over her expressionless face. Behind her the house was silent, but inside her chest something small, sharp, and unexpected had stirred, and she hated it. The sound of ticking echoed through the drawing room, sharp, deliberate, like a judge marking time before a sentence. The grand long-case clock, gifted by the Astors, had once marked the rhythm of Daisy Harlowe's glittering life. Now it seemed louder, more intrusive, as if mocking the silence that had fallen over the once lively halls of her mansion on Fifth Avenue. It was mid-morning. A New York spring sun filtered weakly through sheer lace curtains. Dust motes floated in the golden light, dancing over polished wood and velvet upholstery, slowly losing its luster. The fire had long since burned out in the hearth, but no one came to relight it. The parlour-maids who used to bustle quietly in and out now belonged to a memory Daisy did not care to revisit. She sat alone in the withdrawing room, still in her dressing gown of lilac silk, a piece that had once been part of her trousseau. The fabric clung more loosely now, not from age, but from the quiet thinning of her figure, a consequence of missed breakfasts and untasted suppers. Her maid, Sarah, had not returned since last Thursday. No note, no word, just absence, as cold as the marble floors beneath her feet. A knock came, not from the main entrance, which remained closed like a relic, but from the service door near the kitchen. She didn't rise. The butler, what remained of him, shuffled past the threshold and returned moments later with a cream-colored envelope on a silver tray. Daisy opened it slowly, her fingers precise, careful. The paper bore the crest of her husband's former solicitor. "Mrs. Harlowe, it is imperative that we meet at your earliest convenience regarding the estate's pending obligations. Kindly send word." She didn't send word. She went in person. That afternoon, Daisy climbed into her carriage, a modest one now, drawn by a single horse and driven by a coachman paid through a month-to-month arrangement. She wore a dark blue day dress with a modest bustle and a bonnet that had not seen a Paris milliner in 2 seasons. Her gloves, once perfumed with orange blossom, had grown stiff at the fingertips, but her posture remained immaculate, and her gaze, as always, unwavering. The solicitor's office was nestled on the 2nd floor of a banking house off Broadway. Inside, everything smelled of leather bindings, old cigars, and the damp ink of forgotten ledgers. Mr. Renshaw greeted her with more hesitation than warmth. "Mrs. Harlowe," he said, gesturing stiffly toward a chair. "It grieves me to bring these matters to you." She gave a faint smile. "If grief were profitable, Mr. Renshaw, I should be the wealthiest widow in Manhattan." He coughed awkwardly and opened a folder lined with yellowing documents and creased papers. "There are several holdings we must discuss. Investments your husband made in South American rail ventures. Unfortunately, none of them survived the currency collapse last year. The Newport property has been claimed by creditors. The foundries in Pennsylvania are no longer active, and the mortgage on your Fifth Avenue residence—" She raised a gloved hand. "The house is mortgaged." His silence confirmed it. "How deeply?" she asked, voice calm. "Substantially. Enough that foreclosure may be considered within the next 90 days unless the arrears are addressed." Her jaw tightened. The room pressed in on her. The polished wood walls, the rustle of papers, the faint creak of an office chair, they all collapsed into a low roar in her ears. "There are also pending suits against the estate," Renshaw continued, reluctant. "Former business partners, claims from unpaid builders. I'm afraid the situation is rather delicate." "Delicate?" Her voice sliced the air like a glass edge. "You mean ruined." He cleared his throat and looked away. "There may still be options. Liquidation of valuables. A discreet sale of art or silver. I've heard interest from collectors." Daisy rose, smoothing the folds of her skirt. "You will not arrange anything without my signature, and you will not inform the papers." "Of course not," he said hastily, bowing. But as she stepped into the sunlight once more, the air felt colder. The sound of the city, with its rumbling carriages and shouting newsboys, reached her ears like a distant storm. That evening, she sat at her writing desk and unlocked the drawer that held her husband's ledgers. She ran her fingers over the pages, tracing numbers, watching them blur into silence. She did not cry. Daisy Harlowe had not shed tears since the day they buried William, and even then it had been more from duty than grief. Instead, she called for the steward and gave clear instructions. Every piece of artwork not inherited from her mother's side was to be appraised. The diamond Riviere necklace would be sold to a jeweler in Boston, quietly, of course. The 2 remaining footmen were to be let go. Only Mrs. Winlow, the housekeeper, would remain, for now. That night, her supper tray sat untouched beside her bed. Far away, in the sooty heart of Pittsburgh, Elias Mercer stood at a workbench beneath the harsh yellow glow of gas lamps. Sparks flew from the iron press as his hands guided the new mold, his sleeves rolled high, his forearms slick with sweat and soot. Around him the air smelled of smoke, metal and heat, the scent of labor, of forging, of change. A week had passed since he had left the Harlowe mansion. He had not spoken of the encounter, not to his assistants, nor to the financier who visited that morning with news of a grant from the Iron and Rail Syndicate, but the image haunted him. Daisy Harlowe, in her velvet gown, dismissing him as if he were a servant who had dared raise his eyes. Still, he could not shake the sound of her voice or the way her gaze faltered, only for a second, when she looked at the letter before casting it into the fire. That second was enough. He plunged a glowing rod into a cooling trough and watched the steam rise. "Mr. Mercer," said his assistant from the doorway, "the syndicate is asking about your new compression design." "I'm not ready," Elias replied, his voice low. "But, sir, they've offered double." "I said I'm not ready." He turned, and in his hand the prototype trembled, flawless in form, elegant in design. Steel reimagined, thinner, stronger, revolutionary. He looked at it, and then toward the dim window that showed only the black sky and the glimmer of distant city lamps. Back in New York, Daisy stared at a candle burning low beside her bed. The flame danced like a mocking whisper against the walls. She thought of the letter she had thrown into the fire, not because she had nothing to say in return, but because it had been easier to destroy it than to risk what it might awaken. And as the darkness settled around her, quiet and immense, she reached for the shawl at the foot of her bed, pulled it tight over her shoulders, and told herself she felt no chill at all. 2 years had passed. 2 long, merciless years that had stripped Daisy Harlowe of nearly every illusion she once held dear. In the glittering social circles of New York's upper crust, she had once been spoken of with awe. Her name had adorned society columns, her presence requested at every ball and garden party from Gramercy to Newport. But now her name was spoken in murmurs, if spoken at all, and only with a tone that mixed pity with quiet satisfaction. They called it a decline, as if it were a gentle slope, but Daisy knew the truth. It had been a fall, silent, swift, and it had left her stranded among the ruins of a world that once bowed before her. Her fortune had withered, not in fire or scandal, but in a slow erosion that no one saw coming, least of all her. One by one she sold the jewels, then the paintings, the smaller carriage, the horses, and finally the strings of obligation she once used to pull favor from the powerful. No invitations came that spring, and when the Vanderbilt summer gala arrived, the same one where she had once stood beside Mrs. Astor herself, Daisy's name was no longer on the list. Not forgotten, removed. She heard of it in passing, from her last remaining seamstress, who too would be gone by week's end. "They say it will be the grandest gathering since the Jubilee Ball," the woman had whispered, hesitant, "and that Mrs. Ward has commissioned new pearls just for the occasion." Daisy said nothing. She merely nodded, dismissed the girl, and returned to her parlour with the dignity of a queen. But when she sat in the velvet armchair, her hands trembled. That night, she did not light a single candle. The mansion remained dark, except for the blue glow of moonlight against fading wallpaper and cold, unused mirrors. Far from Manhattan's opulence, in the heart of Pittsburgh's smoky industrial quarter, another world was unfolding. Elias Mercer stood before a crowd of engineers and investors in a soot-darkened warehouse converted into a demonstration hall. On the table before him sat a model, elegant in shape, narrow and strong, forged of steel so fine it could support twice the weight of iron. It was his. The audience leaned forward as he adjusted a lever, revealing a compression system of his own design. The metal withstood pressure without cracking, bending or breaking. Murmurs rose. One by one, the men stood and applauded. He remained silent, his face unreadable, his gaze fixed on the model like a man still not convinced the victory belonged to him. The next morning, the patent office in Washington recorded the name Elias Mercer, beside a title that would soon become famous, Reinforced Thermal Compression for Load-Bearing Steel Rails. And with that signature, everything changed. The rail suppliers came first, then the bridge builders, then the city developers. Within months, Elias was fielding contracts from 6 states. His factory tripled its workforce. A financial firm offered him a partnership. He declined. Quietly, he built something far more powerful: independence. He purchased an office on Broad Street in New York under the name E.M. Landon, a false identity meant to shield his business expansion from attention. He did not want headlines. He wanted distance. And yet, there was one address that continued to haunt him. Number 947, Fifth Avenue, the Harlowe Mansion. He made no inquiries. He requested no photographs. But he never removed it from the list of properties his firm quietly monitored. And when the news came, unexpected, sudden, precise, that the house was to be listed for private sale, he did not hesitate. He sent word through a lawyer. No direct contact, no name, just a transfer and the keys. Meanwhile, Daisy awoke one morning to the sound of voices in the corridor. Mrs. Winlow, the ever-loyal housekeeper, stepped into her room, her eyes unusually pale. "There's a man downstairs, madam, from the law offices of Green and Farthington." Daisy, still seated at her vanity, did not look up. She had grown used to such visits. But this time, something in the air felt final. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand gliding along the banister. The man waiting in the entryway was young, crisply dressed, and clearly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Harlowe," he said, bowing, "I regret to inform you that your property has been purchased. The new owner has exercised the clause in the foreclosure agreement for immediate possession." She blinked. "The house has been sold." He hesitated. "It was acquired by private sale. The buyer wishes to remain anonymous. But the transaction is complete." Daisy's breath caught, though her expression remained composed. "When must I vacate?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Within 3 days." She nodded once, then turned to the marble steps behind her. They stretched upward like a frozen tide, silent, towering, indifferent. "Thank you," she said softly. "That will be all." He left without another word. Outside, the sound of carriage wheels faded into the din of the city. Inside, Daisy walked slowly through the house she had once ruled like an empress. Her fingers touched the banister carved from mahogany, the gilded mirror in the vestibule, the dusty candelabra left unlit for months. She climbed the stairs, each step echoing like the toll of a distant bell. In her bedroom, she opened the wardrobe that still held her finest gowns, each one a memory, each one a ghost. She ran her hands over them, then let the doors swing closed. 3 days. She would leave with her head high, her gloves spotless, and her silence unbroken. What she did not know, what no one could have told her, was that the man who now owned the house she had been born to lose was the same man she had once burned out of her life with a single glance and a handful of cruel words. In Pittsburgh, Elias stood on the roof of a building that now bore his name. The city lights flickered in the distance, and a warm wind stirred the edge of his overcoat. In his hands, he held a copy of the deed. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply looked toward the east, toward New York, and said quietly to the wind, "It's not revenge, it's closure." But even he could not guess that what awaited him behind those tall windows on Fifth Avenue was not the woman who had dismissed him, but the woman who had nothing left to hide. The rain had begun before dawn and showed no signs of easing. It fell steadily, not in anger, but in a quiet, persistent grief, as though the city itself wept for something lost. By mid-afternoon, a grey veil had settled over Fifth Avenue, softening the outlines of its grand facades, muting the carriages that passed like shadows in a dream. Inside the once celebrated Harlowe mansion, silence reigned. Daisy stood in the center of her parlor, dressed in a gown of smoke-blue wool, trimmed with black braid, her gloved hands clasped loosely before her. The room around her was nearly bare. Gone were the oil paintings, the crystal chandeliers, the gilded mirrors that had reflected so many seasons of excess and applause. What remained was the architecture itself, the high ceilings, the marble mantel, the tall windows now streaked with rain. She turned slowly, as if memorizing the space. Her gaze lingered on a faded shadow on the wall where a portrait once hung. The echo of footsteps, long gone, seemed to whisper through the air. There was nothing left to do. Mrs. Winlow had already packed her trunk. The carriage was to arrive by 4, and with it, the end. A sudden knock came at the door. Not timid, not impatient. A deliberate, steady rhythm that did not belong to a servant or a solicitor. Daisy stiffened. Mrs. Winlow peeked from the hallway, her expression curious but wary. "Shall I?" "I'll see to it," Daisy replied, her voice quiet. She crossed the foyer, her boots brushing faint dust from the marble floor. The door creaked slightly as she opened it, and there he stood, Elias Mercer. He had no umbrella, though the rain clung to the shoulders of his dark overcoat like dew on steel. His hair, slightly longer now, was brushed neatly back, and his face, more angular than she remembered, held no smile. He removed his hat with measured formality. "Mrs. Harlowe." Her breath caught. He looked nothing like the man she had once dismissed. There was no soot on his cuffs, no threadbare linen at his collar. His waistcoat was midnight blue, his cravat tied with subtle elegance. A simple silver pin gleamed at his lapel. The storm framed him in shadow and water, but he stood as if untouched by it all, calm, unyielding, immovable. "You," she whispered before she could stop herself. "I've come to take possession of the house," he said evenly. "The papers are in order. I assumed you'd be gone by now." The words struck like a blade dipped in ice. Daisy's chin lifted, though her stomach twisted. The rain delayed the coachman. He nodded once, glancing briefly over her shoulder into the empty interior. When she made no motion to step aside, he spoke again. "May I enter?" She hesitated. Then, with a slow grace born of pride rather than hospitality, she moved. He crossed the threshold without hesitation, his boots leaving faint prints on the marble. He surveyed the space with a familiarity that was not born of memory, but of possession. Not the kind that gropes or flaunts, but the kind that knows it has earned every inch. She watched him, her heart a riot beneath the corset that held her upright. "I did not know," she murmured, "that it was you. That was the point." His tone was still even, but something flickered behind his eyes. Not triumph, not pity, something colder. Something quieter. She turned from him, walking slowly toward the parlor, where the last embers of the morning fire smoldered. He followed. "You bought the house," she said, not as a question. "Yes." She faced him again, and though her hands trembled, she did not hide them. "Why?" He met her gaze without blinking. "Because I could." She flinched. He softened, just barely. "I meant no cruelty. But I've spent years watching powerful men build empires from the ashes of others. I decided I'd rather build mine from stone." A long silence stretched between them. Finally he spoke again, quieter now. "You have nowhere to go, do you?" The question, naked and terrible, hung in the air. Her throat tightened. "I have arrangements. Temporary." He studied her face, her fine features drawn and pale, the regal line of her shoulders beginning to sag under invisible weight. "I'm not offering charity," he said, "but the house is large, and there's no staff yet. You could remain for a time, in exchange for oversight." Her brows lifted, slow and sharp. Oversight? As housekeeper? The word was a slap, but he delivered it without malice, without pleasure. She stared at him, searching for the insult, but there was none. Only practicality. And something else, something she could not name. Not kindness, not affection, something wounded, guarded. Daisy turned away, her arms folding across her chest. "I was raised behind these walls," she said softly, "and now I am to manage them like a servant." "No," he said, "not like a servant. Like someone who knows the house better than I do." She closed her eyes. He waited. At length she spoke. "For how long?" "A fortnight, perhaps longer, until you find what you need." She turned back to him. Her face was pale, but her eyes, those eyes, still held fire. "And you trust me to remain under this roof after everything?" He answered without pause. "Yes." The word struck deeper than any accusation. She exhaled slowly, her hands loosening at her sides. "Very well," she said at last. "I accept." He nodded once. "Mrs. Winlow may remain as well. I assume she is loyal." "She is. Then I'll have no objections." He moved toward the hearth, glancing at the last smouldering coal. "I'll have new contracts sent by the morning," he added, "and I'll sleep in the east wing." She watched him for a long moment. The room, though nearly empty, felt too full. Every breath, every glance, every silence between them pulsed with a history neither had invited and both had survived. As he crossed the threshold toward the staircase, he paused. "Daisy," he said, his voice low. She turned slowly, caught off guard by the sound of her name on his lips. His eyes met hers, and in them, for the briefest instant, she saw something that threatened to undo her, a flicker of memory, of sorrow, of the boy he had once been. But it passed. "Good night," he said. She did not answer. He ascended the staircase, his footsteps even, unhurried. She remained at the hearth, the silence between them spreading like ink in water, and though the rain still fell outside, within those walls, something far more dangerous had begun to stir. The mansion had not changed in its bones, its columns still stood firm, its ceilings remained adorned with gold leaf, and its staircases curved in flawless symmetry, but the life within its walls had become unrecognizable. The grand chandelier in the main hall no longer sparkled with evening light. Only a few lamps flickered through the corridors now, casting long golden shadows over the marble floors. The silence, once dignified, now felt like a sigh held too long. Daisy Harlowe had lived in this house as mistress, as ornament, as symbol. Now she remained as a presence both ghostly and painfully real, no longer celebrated but tolerated. And yet, in some unspoken way, the house still recognized her. She knew every creaking board in the servants' corridor, every chill draught that passed beneath the parlor doors, every window that stuck halfway open. Her footsteps no longer echoed with command, but they still carried memory. She rose early now, not by custom but by necessity. Mrs. Winlow, though fiercely loyal, had aged, and the tasks of dusting, ordering the remaining kitchen stores, and managing correspondence now fell partly to Daisy. She did them without complaint, without comment. Not from humility, not yet, but from something closer to quiet survival. And Elias Mercer? He remained an enigma behind crisp shirts and well-tailored coats. He had not come to gloat, nor had he come to comfort. His demeanor was professional, almost distant. And yet beneath his civility, Daisy sensed the restraint of a man constantly bracing against something deeper. They dined in near silence at the small table in the morning room, which overlooked the neglected winter garden. Elias would take his coffee black, read correspondence from his firm, and only occasionally lift his eyes when she passed him the sugar or poured the tea. He asked nothing of her, but his presence lingered even when he left the room. There were no raised voices, no scandalous scenes, only the tension of nearness, like heat trapped beneath cold stone. Daisy could feel it in the way his eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way her pulse betrayed her every time he entered the room with the scent of rain on his overcoat and coal dust on his skin, in the way his voice, when he did speak to her, always hovered just above warmth, but never dared cross the threshold. The housekeeper's room had become her sanctuary, small and sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, a worn armchair, and a writing desk that had once belonged to a governess. She lit her own lamps now, folded her own linen, stitched the small tears in her gloves by the glow of a single candle. No one spoke her name in society anymore, but the echo of it, when Elias said it once, Daisy, still rang in her memory like a bell that refused to quiet. One evening, a storm passed over the city, rolling in from the Hudson with sudden wind and heavy thunder. Candles flickered in the hallways. The fire in the drawing room sputtered and smoked. Daisy stood at the window, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the trees thrash in the garden below. She heard the door open behind her. "You shouldn't stand by the glass during a storm," Elias said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not afraid of storms," she replied without turning. "They're honest, loud, unapologetic." He moved further into the room, his boots soft on the carpet. "And yet they break windows, flood basements, tear down things you thought were strong." She turned to face him then, her eyes sharp. "Is that what you're waiting for this house to fall? For me to finally kneel before you and confess that I was wrong?" His gaze darkened. "You think I want your humiliation? I think you wanted this, all of it. My disgrace, my dependency, my silence." Her voice trembled with fury she had kept buried too long. "You bought this house not for its bricks, but for the memory of the woman who scorned you." A pause. Then softly, so softly it almost didn't reach her, he said, "No." He stepped closer, the firelight catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. "I bought this house because it was the last thing that still held your shadow." She faltered. For a moment her composure splintered. He went on, his voice low. "Do you think I wanted this? To walk through rooms where I once stood unnoticed, hoping to be seen, to sit at your table while you serve me tea with trembling hands and call it civility?" Daisy's lips parted, but no words came. "You were the only woman I ever wanted," Elias continued, his voice thick with something he fought to contain. "But you made it clear I was invisible, a man of iron and soot, unworthy. And yet I still came back, not to punish you, but to see if there was anything left of the woman I believed in." The silence that followed was deafening. Daisy crossed the room slowly, her eyes never leaving his. The distance between them, once insurmountable, now hung by a thread. "You believed in me," she whispered, as though testing the taste of the words. "Even then?" He nodded. She drew in a breath, her hand curling over the back of the chair beside her to steady herself. "You saw what I couldn't," she murmured, "because I was too proud, too afraid." Elias didn't move, but something in him softened. The storm outside raged louder, the wind slapping against the windows like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Daisy looked away, her voice quieter now. "When you first came back through that door, I hated you, not for buying the house, but because you looked at me with such silence, such absence, as if I no longer mattered, as if I were finally what you always were to me, invisible." Her honesty struck him harder than anger ever could. He took a step toward her, and then stopped. The space between them pulsed with everything unsaid. "We can't rewrite it," he said softly. "What happened?" "No," she agreed, "but we can stop hiding behind it." She turned away then, needing the distance, the air, the illusion of composure. Her fingers traced the cold stone of the mantel. She felt him behind her, close, but still holding back, and for now that was enough. That night they did not speak again, but something had cracked, not loud like thunder, not sudden like lightning, something quiet, a fracture in the ice, a spark in the ashes. Spring crept over New York in hushed tones, less a season and more a whisper, fragile and slow. The days grew longer, warmer, and Fifth Avenue bloomed again with silks, parasols, and the return of open carriages. The morning blacks and winter greys of society's elite gave way to lavender and pale blue, and the sound of pianofortes filtered once more from the parlours of well-dressed homes. Yet the Harlowe mansion remained muted. Though the windows were polished and the brass fixtures gleamed under Daisy's meticulous supervision, the house had not returned to its former glory. It stood like a dowager queen, respected, but no longer adored. Passers-by now looked toward it with curiosity instead of envy, and whispers often followed. "Isn't that the house the tycoon purchased? Didn't she remain as his housekeeper? Imagine falling that far." Daisy heard none of these words directly, but she felt their weight in every glance, every too-sweet smile from former acquaintances who now crossed her path with a tone just shy of pity. The first calling card came in a thick ivory envelope, then another, and another. Names she hadn't seen in 2 seasons: Mrs. Weatherly, Mrs. Grafton, Miss Clara Monroe. The women of society were, at last, returning, but not for her. They came for Mr. Elias Mercer, the man whose fortune now opened every door, the man who, in silence and steel, had become one of the most sought-after names in the city. They arrived draped in silks, bearing cakes, flowers, and light conversation. Daisy served the tea and accepted the looks, polite, curious, cool. No one dared say it aloud, but she had become a symbol, not of tragedy, but of lesson. A tale to be retold in drawing rooms over brandied chocolate, how pride precedes the fall. One morning, just past 11, Mrs. Winlow brought word that a gentleman had arrived unannounced and waited in the gold salon. "He insisted on seeing you, ma'am," she said, lowering her voice. "Says he's an old friend." Daisy frowned. She hadn't used the gold salon in months. It still bore traces of William's taste, too ostentatious, too rich in colour, but she said nothing as she descended the stairs, her pale mauve gown whispering against the marble. She stopped at the threshold. Theodore Grant, tall, silver-templed, and dressed in a brown frock coat of impeccable tailoring, he turned the moment she entered. His smile spread easily. "Daisy." She hesitated before answering. "Mr. Grant, you haven't aged a day, and you haven't changed your tone." He chuckled softly, stepping forward with all the charm of a man used to being welcomed. "It's good to see you." She gestured for him to sit, then took her place across from him, careful to maintain the space between them. "I was surprised to hear you were in the city," she said evenly. "I thought you'd taken permanent residence in Paris." "I had," he replied, adjusting his gloves, "but Paris grew dull. Too many pretenders, too few challenges." He leaned forward, his tone softening. "Then I heard about you, the change in your circumstances." A flicker passed through her gaze, but she remained composed. "I'm not here out of pity," he added quickly. "I'm here because I remember the woman who once outshone every other in this city, and I don't believe her time has passed." She folded her hands in her lap. "What exactly are you proposing?" He smiled. "Partnership, security, marriage, perhaps, or a discreet arrangement. I have resources, Daisy. Enough for two." Her breath caught, but she kept her voice level. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Grant." "Of course not," he said, as if wounded. "But isn't it better to be admired than pitied? To walk again into the world with a man whose name opens doors?" "I've already done that," she whispered. He looked at her, uncertain of what he had just heard. "I need time to consider," she said, rising. He stood as well. "I'll wait." He bowed, kissed her gloved hand, and left the room. She remained standing for several minutes after he'd gone. Upstairs, Elias had watched from the balcony overlooking the hall. He hadn't meant to. He had passed by, intending only to retrieve a set of business papers left in the upper study, but the sight of Theodore Grant below, so polished, so familiar with her, had frozen him, and the sound of Daisy's voice, low and unreadable, had stirred something far darker. Later that night, the house fell into quiet. Mrs. Winlow had retired early, and the lamps in the drawing-room had been dimmed. Elias sat alone by the hearth, a whiskey untouched in his glass. Daisy entered without announcement. She wore a soft wool dressing gown, her hair pinned back loosely, her expression unreadable. "You're working late," she said. He looked up, surprised by her presence. "Not working. Thinking. About business?" "No." She nodded, then hesitated. He set the glass down. "He came to see you today." She stiffened. "You were listening?" "I was passing by." She met his gaze. "Then you heard." "I heard enough." There was a silence, heavy and full. "I never said yes," she added. He rose slowly. "You didn't say no either." Her eyes narrowed, but not in anger. "You presume to judge me?" "No," he said. "I have no right." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "But I thought, after everything, after what we've shared, that you might have told me." "What exactly do you think we've shared?" she asked, the words sharper than she intended. He froze, then stepped back. "You're right," he said, his voice clipped. "Perhaps I imagined too much." She felt the words hit something tender in her chest. "Elias!" He raised a hand. "I'll be leaving the city," he said, his tone now composed. "Selling the house. There's no reason to remain." Her heart dropped. "You're what?" "There are other cities, other investments. And this house, it belongs to memories I no longer wish to carry." She moved toward him, breath quickening. "You can't just walk away." "Can't I?" He turned to leave. She reached for his arm, and the moment her fingers touched his sleeve, he stopped. "Please," she whispered, "don't go." The word, so simple, so quiet, hung between them with the weight of everything left unsaid. He turned slowly, and their eyes met, not as tycoon and fallen heiress, but as man and woman, wounded, proud, trembling, on the edge of something unknown. The storm outside had passed, but inside, something far more powerful had just begun. The Waldorf Astoria shimmered that evening like a palace plucked from a dream. Gaslight chandeliers spilled golden halos across velvet drapes and marble floors, casting soft radiance over the hundreds of glittering guests who filled the ballroom. Gowns rustled like leaves in a summer breeze, violins soared through the floral-scented air, and laughter chimed like crystal flutes. It was the charity ball of the season, whispered about for weeks in salons and supper clubs. The invitation alone had become a mark of social rebirth, and at the center of it all stood Elias Mercer, the man of the hour. His name had been printed at the top of the evening's program, Guest of Honor, for distinguished contributions to infrastructure and civic growth. In the weeks leading up to the event, his portrait had appeared in 3 newspapers, always in dark wool suits, always unsmiling. But tonight, his expression was unreadable. He wore black, a classic evening tailcoat, starched white shirt, white cravat, his presence commanding without ever needing to demand. Across the room, Daisy stood at the edge of the crowd, her gloved hands steady but cold. She wore deep emerald silk, a gown from another life, chosen carefully and not without pain. It had been sewn for her debut as a married woman, when William Harlowe had presented her to society with all the ceremony of a coronation. Tonight, the same fabric clung to a different figure, slightly thinner, stronger, changed. The gown shimmered under the lights, but it did not protect her. She had not intended to attend, but Mr. Theodore Grant had appeared that afternoon with a box of roses and an offer she could neither afford nor refuse. "Everyone who is anyone will be there," he had said, smoothing his gloves. "You belong in that ballroom." "And you?" she asked. "I belong at your side." So there she stood now beside him, arm looped through his, the cold weight of his presence pressing against her as he introduced her to old acquaintances with the performative ease of a practiced showman. "Mrs. Harlowe, of course," he told the Duchess. "Soon to be Mrs. Grant, if I may be so bold." Daisy's spine stiffened. The Duchess smiled politely, the way noblewomen smile at distant thunder. Daisy said nothing. Across the ballroom, Elias saw it all. He stood near the refreshment table, listening to some railroad air explain steel projections in St. Louis, but his eyes never left her. He watched the way Theodore hovered too close, the way Daisy's chin lifted higher with every word the man spoke, the way her smile refused to reach her eyes. He saw the gown, the same one he remembered from a newspaper clipping years ago. Mrs. William Harlowe Stuns at the floral cotillion in emerald silk. He had kept the clipping once. Tonight, she looked like something out of memory and defiance. "Would you care to dance, Mr. Mercer?" asked a delicate voice at his side. It was Miss Charlotte Wincombe, daughter of a shipping baron, all youth and sparkle and practiced curiosity. He nodded, offering his arm. They moved to the center of the floor, just as the violins struck the first notes of a waltz. Their dance was elegant, effortless, but Elias's gaze drifted again. Across the floor, Theodore Grant twirled Daisy in perfect rhythm, his hand firm on her waist. She moved with precision, but not warmth. Her movements were beautiful, but distant, like a painting kept behind glass. Then came the toast. Theodore clinked his glass with a spoon, clearing his throat. "My friends," he began, smiling broadly, "may I have your attention?" The ballroom turned. "Tonight, I raise my glass not only to the noble cause we all support," he continued, "but to the woman who has agreed to share my future." A ripple of sound swept the room. Gasps, soft laughter, expectant glances. Elias froze. Daisy's lips parted. "Theodore—" He didn't stop. "To Daisy Harlowe, soon to be Mrs. Grant." Daisy stepped back slightly, her face pale. But it was too late. The toast had been made, the assumption cemented. Polite applause followed. Eyes turned. Smiles formed. And across the room, Elias set down his glass without a word. He turned and walked away before the music resumed. Daisy barely managed to exit the dance floor before she followed him with her gaze. But the ballroom had swallowed him. The shadows had taken what light remained. The rest of the evening blurred. She barely spoke. Theodore, emboldened by the reaction, behaved as if the engagement were fact. She said nothing. She could not bring herself to cause a scene. But in her chest, something had fractured. When she returned home, it was past midnight. The house was quiet, the fire in the library extinguished. Mrs. Winlow met her at the door, her face pinched with worry. In her hand was an envelope, thick, cream-coloured, sealed in wax. "This came for you, ma'am," she said softly, "left by Mr. Mercer's valet. He asked that you receive it privately." Daisy took it slowly. In her room, she lit a single lamp and sat before her vanity, her gloves still on. Her earrings still glittering like tears, she broke the seal. "Daisy, there are moments when silence speaks louder than thunder. Tonight was one of them. I stood in a room of strangers and heard your name offered like a prize, and I realized I had nothing left to wait for. You once told me I didn't belong behind the velvet curtains of your world. I believed you, but I came back anyway, because some part of me thought you might see me differently now. I was wrong. I leave tomorrow at dawn. No farewell is required. No reply is expected, but if you ever wonder why I came back, know this: it was never to take your house. It was to see if your heart still lived there. E.M. She did not cry. She sat very still, the letter trembling in her hands, the sound of the wind brushing against the windows like a distant echo of a memory that refused to die. Outside, the first light of morning touched the edge of the skyline. And inside, Daisy Harlowe finally understood what it meant to lose something you never truly held. The streets of New York were still asleep when Daisy stepped out into the thick morning fog. A pale mist clung to the cobblestones, curling around iron fences and the hooves of early delivery horses like fingers reluctant to let go of the night. The city, which by midday would roar with life, now breathed in hushed whispers, as if it too awaited something unspeakably fragile. Her boots struck the ground in hurried rhythm, echoing off stone walls, each step fueled by a mixture of dread and hope, so sharp it stole her breath. She clutched her cloak tight around her as wind tugged at her hem. Beneath her skirts, her knees trembled, but she pressed forward, navigating the maze of carriages and market carts with a desperation that paid no mind to decorum. She hadn't slept. Not after reading the letter. Not after the silence that followed. She had stared at the envelope for hours, rereading every word as if meaning might shift between the lines. But there had been no ambiguity. Elias Mercer was leaving. And with him, something more vital than pride, more devastating than ruin. He was taking with him the man who had seen her, the real her, even when she had buried herself in silk and distance. The train to Boston departed just past dawn. She had less than 30 minutes. She didn't know if he would wait until the last moment, or if he would board as soon as the doors opened. All she knew was that she could not let him leave without saying what should have been spoken long ago. As she neared the station, the fog thickened. Smoke curled from chimneys, mingling with the steam that hissed from the iron belly of the locomotive. Porters moved like shadows, loading luggage, calling names. The clamour was soft, almost reverent, as if the very air acknowledged the weight of goodbye. She saw him. Elias stood near the second platform, his coat buttoned high, a small travel bag at his side. He held no umbrella. The damp clung to his shoulders, and yet he stood unmoving as if the chill could not touch him. Daisy halted. For one brief, breathless second, she considered turning back. Her gloved hand hovered over her chest, her lungs aching from the rush, from the fear, from the years. But he was there, and she had come too far. She crossed the final stretch of platform slowly, her shoes slick on the stone. When she reached him, he turned at once, as if he had known she would come. His expression did not shift, but his eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto hers with a heat that made her shiver. "I thought you'd already gone," she said, voice quiet, winded. "I was waiting," he replied simply. "For what?" He didn't answer. The silence between them was vast, but not empty. She took a breath and stepped closer. "I read your letter," she said. "Every word, twice." He nodded once, but said nothing. "I thought I had time," she whispered. "I thought I could carry this pride a little longer, that I could pretend it didn't matter." She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "But you were right. I don't know how to speak of love. I never learned. I was too busy learning how to wear gowns, how to smile at men I didn't trust, how to host dinners that meant nothing. I was raised to believe that silk and marble were worth more than sincerity." She paused, searching his face. "And I let that lie cost me the only man who ever looked at me like I wasn't a prize or a possession." Elias's jaw clenched. His breath misted in the morning air. Daisy stepped closer. "I told you once you didn't belong behind the velvet curtains of my world. But you did. You were the only one who did. I was the one who didn't belong." She could feel the tears rising, hot and aching behind her eyes, and then before she could think, before she could stop herself, she knelt, right there, on the cold stone of the platform, her emerald skirts pooling around her like crushed leaves, her gloved hands trembling as they clasped before her. "I don't care who sees," she said. "I don't care what it costs me. I was wrong, about everything." Elias's breath caught. "I once believed this house was my worth," she whispered. "That Fifth Avenue and crystal chandeliers and the Harlowe name defined me, but now I know it wasn't the house. It was the man who stood at its door and waited for me." He dropped his bag. In one swift, fluid motion, he stepped forward and reached down, grasping her wrists, not to pull her up but to hold her steady. "Daisy," he said, his voice low, ragged, "don't do this. I need to." "No." He guided her gently to her feet. She rose, swaying slightly, her gaze never leaving his. Elias stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time, not the woman in emerald silk or the widow of a tycoon, but Daisy, plain, beautiful, breakable. "I never stopped loving you," he said, voice quiet. "Not when you looked through me, not when you cast my letter into the fire, not even when I watched another man claim you in front of a ballroom full of strangers." Her lips parted, a sob escaping like a prayer. "I've tried to forget you," he said. "I've tried to hate you. But all I ever wanted was you." She touched his cheek with trembling fingers. "Then take me, not as I was, but as I am. No silks, no name, just me." He leaned in slowly, eyes locked to hers, as if giving her one last chance to disappear. She didn't. Their lips met. It was not a kiss of triumph, not a kiss of conquest. It was a kiss of sorrow, of forgiveness, of every word left unsaid between two souls who had burned and bled in silence. It trembled with restraint, with aching tenderness, with the fear of breaking again. Around them the station stirred, the conductor's whistle, the clang of metal, the rustle of skirts and bags and hurried steps. But they remained there, unmoved, the fog wrapping around them like a secret. When they parted, Elias cupped her cheek. "Come home," he whispered, and in her eyes there was no longer pride, only peace. The chapel was small, tucked behind a row of sycamore trees on the edge of the city, where the wind moved gently through the leaves and the bells rang without grandeur. It was not the kind of place where society gathered. No duchesses, no reporters, no marble columns or gilded altars. Only quiet pews, soft candlelight, and the scent of spring lilacs drifting in through the open doors. Daisy Harlowe stood near the altar in a gown the colour of dove wings, her gloved hands trembling as she held a modest bouquet of white gardenias. Her veil was sheer, without lace or embroidery, pinned with a single pearl comb that had once belonged to her mother. She had not worn diamonds. She had not borrowed rubies or emeralds. She had chosen simplicity, not as an act of penance, but as a declaration of freedom. Across from her, Elias stood in a tailored charcoal suit, crisp and clean, yet without ostentation. His boutonniere was a single sprig of rosemary for remembrance, In his hand he held a narrow silver band, forged not by a jeweler, but by his own hand in the Pittsburgh workshop, where his life had been rebuilt from the ruins of rejection. It bore no stones, no carvings, only strength. The minister's voice faded into the stillness as the vows were exchanged. No one wept, yet the air shimmered with emotion. Mrs. Winlow, seated in the second pew, clutched a linen handkerchief and blinked quietly at the ceremony she had never dared dream of witnessing. Behind her, a seamstress from the women's refuge sat beside a florist who had offered the blooms in exchange for a repaired gate. There were no violins, no photographers. Only the moment, and the two people who had finally chosen it, not because they were forced, not because they were admired, but because they were ready. When Elias slid the ring onto Daisy's finger, her breath caught, not from surprise, but from recognition. Steel, the same element that had built railroads, bridges, and him. Her eyes met his, and something deep and wordless passed between them. The minister pronounced the union, and for the first time since she had stepped into the world as Mrs. William Harlowe, Daisy belonged entirely to herself, and to a man who saw her not as ornament or obligation, but as choice. They left the chapel with no fanfare. Only the carriage waited, its simple black body gleaming in the soft sunlight, the reins held by a young driver who offered no knowing smile, only a tip of the hat. Inside the cabin, they sat in silence at first, not from awkwardness, but reverence. Daisy's hand rested gently atop Elias's, the wedding band catching the light in quiet reflection. As they approached Fifth Avenue, the mansion came into view, not cold, not proud, but softened somehow by ivy creeping along the stone and tulips blooming along the path. Daisy stared out the window, her heart tightening. "What do you see?" Elias asked gently. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "A place I never thought I'd enter again. Not as myself." He said nothing, only squeezed her hand. The front door opened before they reached the steps. Mrs. Winlow waited in her usual dark dress and apron, her eyes brighter than they had been in months. "Welcome home," she said simply. Daisy paused at the threshold. The wood beneath her feet, once so imposing, now felt warm, familiar. She stepped inside, her veil fluttering behind her like a ghost finally released. Over the following weeks, the mansion transformed, not with chandeliers or gold leaf, but with life. The heavy drapes in the drawing room were replaced with light linen curtains. The kitchen was opened again, not for elaborate dinners, but for fresh bread, hot tea, and the scent of oranges that Elias insisted on bringing from the market every Tuesday. Rooms once used for formal receptions became reading spaces. The music room, silent for years, now held a modest upright piano, which Daisy began to play softly in the evenings, her fingers hesitant but slowly remembering the keys. She rose early again, but now not out of necessity. She woke to the sound of Elias's voice in the corridor or the thump of books on the parlor table. Sometimes they did not speak until mid-morning. Other times they lingered over coffee until the sun crept too high. They learned each other's rhythms, as if rediscovering an old language, how he preferred silence while reading, how she needed the window cracked open no matter the season, how he hated strong perfume, how she could not fall asleep unless the hallway lamp was dimmed to near dark. One afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the windows, Daisy returned from her first visit to the women's refuge. She had gone without much intention, only a curiosity, a half-formed sense that perhaps she could be useful. But what she found there were stories not unlike her own, women who had lost everything, women whose names had once carried weight and now carried only shame, women who had knelt for love, for survival, and were still learning how to rise again. She stayed for hours. When she returned home, damp at the hem and flushed from the cold, Elias met her at the door. "You're late," he said softly, taking her shawl. "I lost track of time." He brushed a damp curl from her forehead. "You looked like someone who remembered where she was needed." Daisy looked up at him, her smile small but radiant. I did. They sat by the fire that night, not speaking much, just breathing the same quiet air. His hand brushed hers, and she did not pull away. Her head leaned against his shoulder, and he closed his eyes. There were no declarations, no grand gestures, only the steady, patient beat of something true. One evening, Daisy stood in the garden, now trimmed and in bloom, watching the sky darken over the city. Elias joined her, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, smelling faintly of leather and ink. "It's different now," she murmured. "The house." He nodded, "because it finally belongs to people, not performance." She turned to him. "Do you ever miss it? The ambition? The race for more?" His eyes met hers. "I have what I never thought I'd have." "What else could I want?" Daisy smiled, her heart full in a way she had never known, not of victory, but of peace. That night, in their room, she removed her gloves and held out her hand. Elias took it, his fingers grazing the steel ring. "You built it," she whispered, "so it wouldn't break." And as they lay in the hush of the house, listening to the city breathe outside, the past, its ghosts, its regrets, its hunger, finally let go. In its place, something quieter had taken root. Not a mansion, a home. It was late afternoon in early autumn, and the garden at the rear of the Harlowe house glowed with golden light. Sunbeams slipped through the branches of the sycamores, glinting off the still water in the stone fountain, where a group of children played beneath the watchful gaze of their governesses. Their laughter rose like song, echoing softly against the ivy-covered walls. From the terrace above, Daisy Mercer stood in quiet observation, her hands resting lightly on the balustrade, worn smooth by time. She wore a gown of soft grey wool, elegant in its simplicity, the neckline lined with fine lace. Her posture was graceful, still regal, but tempered now by a gentler kind of strength. Her face, framed by silver-threaded auburn hair pulled into a modest twist, held no trace of the sharp pride it once carried. The years had softened her beauty, but not dulled it. Her eyes remained expressive, clear, full of memory and calm. Behind her, the tall French doors of the drawing-room stood open, and the sheer curtains billowed inward with the breeze, just as they had on the day Elias first stepped over the threshold as master of the house. It had been more than 15 years since that morning. The house was no longer what society remembered. The grand receptions and cold performances of wealth had long since faded. In their place was a home that breathed with warmth, walls that held stories, not secrets, rooms that echoed with music, not silence. Guests came now not to impress or be seen, but to be welcomed, and many came without titles or fortune. Daisy had spent the years not in retreat, but in quiet service. Her work at the Women's Refuge had grown. She had helped establish 2 new homes for displaced widows and abandoned mothers. Her name, once synonymous with scandal, had returned to drawing rooms with a different meaning, a name not of fallen grace, but of earned dignity. "Still watching the world from your balcony, Mrs. Mercer?" The voice came from behind, deep and warm, tinged with amusement. Daisy turned, smiling. Elias stood in the doorway, a book in one hand, his reading spectacles still resting against the front of his vest. His hair, once dark and thick, had greyed handsomely. He had aged with quiet pride, lines at the corners of his eyes, the strength of his shoulders still firm, the gentleness of his gaze only deepened by time. "I watch because it never stops changing," she said, her voice soft, touched with emotion. "And because sometimes I need to remind myself it's real." He stepped beside her, his hand finding hers with the ease of habit, their fingers intertwined without ceremony. "Those children," she whispered, nodding toward the garden, "they remind me of what we never had, and still, I don't feel something is missing." Elias looked down at her. "That's because what we built," he said, "was never measured in what we lacked, but in what we chose. Every day." A silence passed between them, full of meaning. They watched as one of the children, a girl in a red ribbon, ran too fast, stumbled, and was caught mid-fall by another child, an older boy with sand-colored hair and a protective instinct. "They look like us," Daisy said without thinking. Elias chuckled. "If they start arguing about velvet curtains, I'll worry." She smiled, shaking her head, then turned to the side wall of the terrace, where an old window with thick damask drapery framed the interior. Her hand rose, fingers brushing the edge of the fabric. "I once told you," she murmured, almost to herself, "that you didn't belong behind these." Elias didn't speak. He let her finish. She turned to him, her eyes misted, her voice low and steady. "But the truth is, you belonged here more than anyone ever did. You taught me how to live beyond them. You showed me that home isn't what's behind the curtain, it's who opens it with you." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I didn't come to this house to conquer it," he said quietly. "I came to find you inside it." She stepped into his arms, letting her cheek rest against his chest, listening to the beat that had never betrayed her, even when her pride had. "Tell me something," he said after a long pause. "What? When you first saw me, standing in the rain at that door, did you hate me?" She pulled back just enough to look into his face. "No," she said. "I hated myself for being the kind of woman who had everything, but never saw the man who truly mattered." His expression softened. "But then," she added, "I became the woman who saw nothing else." The sun dipped lower, casting the garden in copper light. The children were called in by their governesses, and the air quieted with the hush of approaching evening. Elias led her gently back inside. The drawing room had changed little, yet everything was different. There were no gilded chairs, no Italian vases. Instead, there were bookshelves, worn armchairs, a tea table with mismatched china, and the faint scent of lavender from a vase by the window. As Daisy settled into her chair by the fire, she glanced toward the curtain once more. "I used to think pride made this house strong," she said. Elias, now seated beside her, lifted her hand and kissed the back of it with reverence. "And now?" he asked. She looked at him, at the lines around his eyes, at the silver in his hair, at the man who had never left even when he had walked away. "Now I know the truth." He waited. "Pride once built this house," she whispered, "but love made it a home." The fire cracked softly. Outside, the world continued to turn, but within those four walls, the story had reached its quiet, perfect ending. New York, autumn of 1900. The century had turned, and with it, the rhythm of the city had changed. Buildings climbed higher into the sky, streetcars rattled along electrified rails, and women in tailored skirts walked briskly beneath the gaslights. But on the quiet stretch of Fifth Avenue, where ivy still curled up the side of an old stone mansion, time seemed to move more gently. The house, once a monument to pride, now lived in soft dignity. Its garden bloomed in quieter colors. Its windows glowed not with grandeur, but with warmth. Inside, the drawing room had aged with grace. Books lined every wall. A worn carpet bore the traces of countless steps, and the scent of sandalwood lingered in the air. The upright piano, now used by smaller hands, carried the echo of a melody left unfinished. By the window, Daisy Mercer sat in a sunlit chair, a half-knitted shawl resting in her lap. Her eyes, still sharp beneath silver lashes, followed the movement of a boy in the garden. Their son, Thomas, nearly 7, his auburn hair catching the light as he ran barefoot through the fallen leaves. "He's always in motion," she said, her voice low, touched with fondness. "Just like his father." From the doorway, Elias stepped in, his steps slower now, but no less certain. His hair had turned fully silver, his shoulders softened with time, but the strength in his gaze had never faded. "And just like his mother," he added, "he never does anything halfway." She smiled, setting the shawl aside. "Did the board meeting go well?" He nodded, sitting beside her. "They want me to open another foundry near Albany. I told them no." "No?" She raised an eyebrow. "I have enough. We have enough." She placed her hand over his, their fingers instinctively lacing together. Outside, Thomas climbed onto the edge of the stone fountain and shouted something to the sky only he could understand. They watched him in silence, the kind that no longer held tension or questions, only memory. "Do you regret," she began softly, "that we had him so late?" Elias turned to her. "I regret only the years we spent apart. But if those years brought us to now, I'd live them twice." A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable weight of gratitude. So much had changed. The women's refuge had expanded, now with 3 branches across the city. Daisy still taught reading and needlework to girls whose names society would never remember, but who left her classroom with dignity no man could strip away. Elias had retired from most of his businesses. He had given his workers better wages than any tycoon in the city, and was known in working-class circles not as a giant, but as a fair man. He had turned down awards, refused interviews, and never allowed his portrait to hang in any of the steel halls that bore his name. But not all lives had found peace. Theodore Grant, once so polished, had lost everything in a failed investment scheme. He fled to London under a cloud of scandal, never to return. His name, once so carefully curated, had vanished from the papers. No one spoke of him now. Mrs. Winlow had passed 3 years prior, in the same room where she had once overseen every corner of the household. Daisy held her hand until her final breath, and later planted a magnolia tree in her memory at the edge of the garden. Now, 7 years since the morning Daisy had knelt on a train platform, the love that had once been uncertain had become the very foundation of their days. Not dramatic, not fiery, but constant. In the evenings, Elias read aloud by the fire, Thomas curled against his side. Daisy listened with her eyes closed, her needlework forgotten in her lap. And sometimes, when the night was especially quiet, she would lean into her husband's shoulder and whisper, "Do you remember when I thought the curtains were more important than the man outside them?" He always smiled. "And do you remember what you said in the garden?" She nodded. "Pride once built this house." He kissed her hand. "But love made it a home." And the fire would crackle softly, as if in agreement. Outside, the city marched toward the future. But inside that house on 5th Avenue, time bowed to love, a love that had learned how to endure, not just in the face of loss, but through the long, quiet triumph of forgiveness. When pride builds walls, love finds the courage to tear them down. Daisy and Elias's journey reminds us that sometimes the deepest healing comes not in grand declarations, but in quiet moments, in a shared book by the fire, in a hand held through loss, in the strength to start again. Their love wasn't perfect, but it was real. It grew not from wealth or appearances, but from the choices they made when no one was watching. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder. No matter your past, you are worthy of love that stays, love that listens, love that rebuilds. Tell me in the comments, what part of this story moved you the most? And if you made it all the way to the end, type the word home, so I know you're one of the few who walked every step with Daisy and Elias. Help this story reach more hearts, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and don't forget to explore the other timeless love stories I've left for you in the cards above. Thank you for being here. Your presence means more than you know.